Okay, so yeah, so Sarath is now going to present his proposal. I believe, how long did you plan for, Sarath, for the presentation?
50 to 55 minutes.
50 to 55 minutes.
Yeah.
And then I think the committee members can stop,
Yeah.
in the middle, stop him in the middle for, clarification questions. People who are not on the committee, if you have questions, perhaps wait until the presentation is over, just so that there's a flow. Let's get started. Sarath, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Professor, for that introduction. And thank you, everyone, for coming to my proposal. So the topic of my proposal is Foundations of Human-Aware Explanations for Sequential Decision-Making Problems. So my committee includes Dr. Subbarao Kampampati, who is also the chair, Dr. Bean Kim, Dr. David Smith, Dr. Siddharth Srivastava, and Dr. Yu Zhang. So, okay, let's get started. So I hope everyone gathered here would agree that we are living in exciting times as far as AI is concerned. So every day we hear new news about the new and more challenging problems that AI has solved, and the AI is getting applied in almost every aspect of our life. And you can find AI systems all the way from the farthest reaches of space to the roads of Phoenix. So on the other hand, even with all these successes, our AI system also relies heavily on AI-aware people to interact with. What I mean by that is most of the systems are actually expects people who are trained to use these kind of systems and who are kind of familiar with the kind of idiosyncrasies of the system. So this is far from what we want to be, right? We would want to create general robust systems that are able to work with people from all walks of life, right? I would hope one day I can see robots that are put into use in villages in India, where a village elder could work with such robots. So what's the missing piece? As far as I'm concerned, one of the big changes we need to do is shift from a focus on developing purely systems that are purely designed on achieving its objective to one that is aware of the fact that it is doing so in a world that is full of people, and people have their own beliefs and expectations from these systems. And every action that the agent does in some way have effects on those people and are also judged by those people based on their beliefs. In other words, we need to move away from AI-aware people to human-aware agents. So what do I mean by this, right? Let's just look at a simple human-aware planning setting. So most of my discussion here is going to be, as the title hopefully suggests, is going to be on sequential decision-making problems, specifically planning problems. To kind of see the challenges related to human-aware planning, let's look at one of the most basic human-aware planning setting, one that consists of a single human and a robot. And the only actor in this setting is the robot trying to achieve its objectives. So the robot has some task, some model of its task called MR, and it's using its reasoning capabilities to come up with some plan or policy that it can execute to achieve its goal. And on the other hand, the human is observing what the agent is doing. The human has its own model of what the task would be and what the robot's task in general, or what the robot's model of the task is. And they are using their own inferential capabilities to come up with some expectations on what the agent should be doing. So did somebody have a question? No. Okay. So on a general note, so basically when I'm using the term task, I'm usually talking about some representation of the task dynamics and the reward cost function, etc. In general, most of the ideas I'll be talking here are agnostic, can be applied more widely, but most of my examples and a lot of my works are focused on these kind of goal-directed deterministic model, particularly ones where the system has access to these kind of action-centered descriptions. So in the slide, you can see an example description of an action called pickup. So basically, I won't get into too much details, but basically what that description is telling us is when can you do the action called pickup? which in this case is the preconditions, and what happens when you do the pickup, which is the effects of the thing. But again, these ideas aren't just for deterministic problems or just for PDDL, which is the name of the description language. And I have already applied some of these things to like MDP settings, and we'll get to it as we move through the slides. Okay, so now that we've defined the domain, what's the first challenge that could happen, right? The obvious thing that could happen is what the human thinks the system should do might not match what the agent actually decides to do. And this is one of the fundamental challenges of like human-aware planning. How do we deal with and avoid these kind of mismatches? Because in the best case scenario, such a mismatch would still lead to confusion on the human end, but in the worst case, this could have ramification in terms of the safety of the human and things like that. And in a sense, this is the central question I'm trying to handle in my thesis. In particular, there are like two broad strategies one we can think about handling this kind of mismatch. One is the agent decides to do what it wants to do, and then it'll explain to the person, okay, this is what I am going to do, and this is why I'm doing it. This could also be driven by some questions from the human side. And in the another broad strategy is the agent actually changes what it's actually going to do to be more in line with what the human expects. In particular, my thesis is mostly focused on the first part, which is the explanation part. How does an agent effectively explain the reason for its decision? I will only talk about explicability insofar as how it can help minimize explanation and so forth. So the central focus is going to be about explanation. So since we brought up the term explanation, at least in this talk, whenever I use the term explanation, I'm specifically referring to answers to why questions. In particular, two questions of interest that you'll see popping up again and again is, why was this plan? Why was this plan selected? Or the question, why was this plan selected over some alternative? So it's a contrastive version of the question where you would ask, okay, why this plan as opposed to other. In general, I would view all explanation as an attempt to reduce asymmetries between the agent and the human. And one way to kind of make sense or like understand different explanation work is kind of think about what are the dimension in which that asymmetry is being reconciled. A few of the things we'll talk about today is reconciling knowledge differences between the agent and the human, bridging differences in inferential capabilities, and finally making sure that the human and the robot are talking in a common vocabulary so they can understand each other in the sense. I'll also use these dimensions to kind of categorize the works that I have already completed as part of my thesis and also works that I'm proposing to do. In particularly, you can see that I've finished some work both in model differences and inferential differences. And the bulk of my proposed work are going to be part of addressing vocabulary differences. I'll also be using these dimensions to kind of structure my talk. So I'll start with works that I've done in first addressing asymmetry in knowledge, where basically the human and the robot thinks differently about the task itself. And then I'll talk about methods I've used to kind of address when the cases where the human and the robot might have different inferential capabilities. And finally, for the proposed work, I'll talk about the work I'm currently doing and plan to do on addressing differences in vocabulary, where the systems is reasoning in terms that the human doesn't understand to begin at the starting point. And then I also will talk about extending some of my earlier works in addressing inferential capability differences to stochastic settings. Okay, so let's start with the first part, which is basically addressing asymmetry in knowledge, and particularly this framework called model reconciliation explanations. Okay, so the simplest setting is, again, let's go back to our simplest human-aware planning setting. You have a human, you have a robot. Now, the question is, what happens when humans' belief about the model does not match what the robot thinks its model is? So even if both the human and the agent are like optimal planners or optimal reasoners, what the plan that the system may come up with may look inoptimal, or in worst case, even invalid to the human. Like, the human might be thinking, okay, why is the agent trying to do this plan that doesn't make any sense with respect to the task? So here, at a high level, it might seem, okay, this seems a simple enough problem, right? All the human has to do is kind of give it, all the robot has to do is just kind of give its model to the human. Unfortunately, for most cases, this might not be a good strategy. Okay, to kind of ground what that means is, let's just look at as anyone would want to buy like a block stacking robot, and you got your latest and greatest block stacking robot, and you brought it home, assembled it, and asked it to make a stack of 3 blocks. So at the starting point, it already has 2 of the blocks stacked, and what you would have expected is all it has to do is pick up the purple block and put it on top of the already stacked 2 blocks. But instead, what you see is this weird long way of stacking the 3 blocks. So if you were to ask, why did you do this? And the reason you can't make sense of it is because the agent knows something that you don't. Just imagine the agent just dumping their entire robot manual to you, right? There could be a lot of information. Some information that you might have already known, some you don't, but many of this not relevant to your question at hand, which is why this plan, right? So there could be actions about the robot running and jumping that is completely irrelevant to the question, the plan at hand. Instead, what we would want to do is to kind of find out what is the minimal amount of information that the system has to provide to the human, so they can kind of make sense of the plan at hand. And this was the problem we kind of studied in this framework called model explanation as model reconciliation, where basically we formulated this idea of a minimally complete explanation, which is the minimal amount of information about the robot's model that needs to be provided to the human, so they can update their own beliefs about the robot. And in this updated model, they can make sense of the plan. So MCE specifically looks for the minimal amount of information. This whole process of identifying this explanation can be like framed as a search over model spaces. So at one point, at the one end of the, like the starting point of the search, you have your humans model. And every step in the search, basically you update the model towards the robot's actual model. And you end the search as soon as you find an updated model where the plan makes sense. So I'm leaving the term plan makes sense a bit vague because it could take different meaning in different contexts. In our original work, we looked at optimality, as in like we'll give enough information to be optimal. That doesn't always have to be the case. There are other criteria you can look at. And as I was saying, each step here corresponds to some additional piece of information. And the solution here is going to be all the information that you need to give to get to the final goal. So in the example we just saw, all the explanation that the system needed to give was, I can only pick light blocks, and the purple block is not a light block, right? So that's all the information that we needed. It didn't have to talk about how it can jump or fly or things like that, right? So minimally complete explanation is just one form of explanation. In that paper, we did look at other kinds like monotonic explanation and so on, but I won't get into too much detail, but we can always come back and discuss these explanation in more detail if anybody's interested. So in terms of evaluation, this is something I think you would see in most of my work as, you would see both an evaluation which looks at some of the computational properties, which is usually measured in using some benchmark domains like these planning benchmark and stuff like that. And then we also did some, here basically the results just show the time taken and the quality of the explanation generated for different variations of the search we just discussed. And then we also did a user study where we basically allowed people to work with a simulated search and rescue scenario where they were initially shown some possibly incorrect map. They are shown the robot model and some explanations. And for different types of explanation, what we tried to measure was whether after the explanation, people able to correctly determine the optimality and validity of the plan. So in the sense that are these model information as explanation helping them understand the plan correctly? And in the study, we did various, like we tested with like various types of explanation, not just various types of model reconciliation explanation, not just MCAs. Okay, so that was the basic framework. And now let's talk about the big elephant in the room. So if I'm sure most people noticed when I was talking about the model space search, you are actually starting from the mental model of the human and you are making changes one by one. So there is that implicit assumption that the system knows the model of the human. In some cases, this is perfectly acceptable. So one of the examples would be something like a search and rescue scenario, where the human and the robot potentially starts with the same model of the world, which is just like a map. And due to the fact that the robot is in the field doing different activities, it now knows the current state of the world that the human might not. So this is an example where the system knows the exact model the human starts with and can use it to provide explanation, but it doesn't necessarily have to be true in the general case. So now the question is, how do we relax this assumption that the system actually needs the human's exact model to come up with explanation? So I looked at few versions of this question. The first version is, okay, let's assume we don't have the exact model. Instead, what we have is a set of possible models. Okay, so and all the robot knows is the human's model is one of these possible sets. So one possible case where this could arise very naturally is if the system learned a kind of an incomplete model, which takes these kind of like annotated model kind of a form. So here is going back to our pickup example. Here is an annotated version of the pickup example, where in addition to the preconditions and effects, you also have this annotation on possible precondition. It says maybe the human knows that the robot can only pick up light blocks, maybe it doesn't. And then one single annotation here would correspond to two possible models. And the model could have multiple annotation and it could kind of blow up very easily into a large set of possible models. So given such an annotated model and by that fact, a set of possible models, how do we handle explanations? The first possibility is to kind of look at generating conform and explanation. So by conform and explanation, what I mean is you will come up with a single set of explanatory messages that would work for all the models in the set. So I'm trying to explain a given plan, and I have a set of possible models for the human, and I'll come up with a single set of explanations that would work for like that. When applied to each individual model in the set, the plan would be valid or optimal or whatever property you're trying to explain, right? So the easiest way to think about generating these kind of explanation is to think in terms of belief space search. So now going back to our earlier model space search, now each search node is not a single model, but you have a set of possible models. And each action, or which is each explanatory message you can give, now updates all the possible members of this set, right? And the goal test is we will stop the search when we reach a belief node where all the members of the node will satisfy the property you're trying to explain. So that becomes the path to that node becomes your conformant explanation. So this might seem extremely like a huge jump from our previous search, which itself is not quite an easy search to do because you're like running, trying to test the properties of different models. But thankfully, if we are representing models as these annotated models, we can actually, there is a lot of structure there that we could exploit to make the search a lot easier. So in fact, if you're looking at an annotated model, there always going to be, and if you know your problem is actually expressed as like a positive precondition PDL model. I can get to the details if anyone is interested, but if those conditions are met, we can think of the set of possible models corresponding to an annotated model, including this most constrained model and the most relaxed model. And all we need to do is explain with respect to these two models. So regardless of this, if the set includes like thousands or 10,000s of models, we only need to consider these two models. And to make sure the plan is optimal in the entire set, all you need to say is the plan is optimal in the most relaxed model and valid in the most constrained model. So that way you can do this. So this kind of takes in, like, it's if people are familiar with version spaces, it's kind of similar ideas are being used here. Okay, so the other possibility is we can actually rely on interaction, right? You can have the people actually ask, like have the system actually ask questions about different parts of the model it might have uncertainty over, and use that information to kind of simplify the explanation. So this takes the form of a conditional explanation where there are questions and then there are explanations being provided. You could even have an online version of the explanation where you just like make assumptions on the fly as you do search. And whenever you are ready to give an explanation, you test those assumptions by checking with the human, like, do you have these values and stuff like that. And then if those assumptions are not met, then you do more and more search. So in terms of evaluation, since this is just model reconciliation explanation, the focus was more on empirical evaluation. I won't go into much details here. The results are in the paper, and I'm always happy to help happy to talk if anybody has any questions. Okay, now that was the case where we at least had a set of possible models. Now the question is, what if we don't really have that set? But we don't, the system doesn't know anything about the human model, but you have access to a set of possible people with similar background. In this case, one could try to learn a model that learn a simple labeling model that kinds of tells the system what kind of explanations to get. So the basic intuition here is, the crux of the thing is, the set of all possible explanatory messages, even though the minimal explanation depends on the human's actual starting model, the set of all possible messages you can give is going to be limited, because you are only going to tell information that are part of the robot's model. That means you can actually learn these kind of interaction data sets where you have behaviors, explanations, and a set of explanatory messages, and whether with those set of explanatory messages, would people find this behavior explicable or not? As in, like, do they understand the behavior given these messages? So this particular work was looked at in the context of NDP. So the behavior here was specifically state action, state traces, and whether those can be sampled from one of the optimal policies in what a human would think is the best strategy to use. And now to kind of like figure out, like to kind of see how these and basically these data sets are turned into a labeling model where you learn a labeling model that takes these things and actually classifies whether the person would say this is explicable or not. So to kind of see how these labeling models could be helpful, we can now go back to our model space search, and instead of searching over models, now we search over set of possible explanatory messages. And we will do the same kind of search, and we'll end the search as soon as we reach a set of possible messages where the given behavior we want to explain, our labeling model will say that given these messages, the human would say all of these things, all of these behavior makes sense. Okay, so in terms of evaluating it, the focus here was on whether we can learn these kind of labeling models effectively. So we tested it both on data generated from a benchmark, like from a synthetic human, where the models were just like randomly created, and also data collected from like mechanical Turkers on like where they see different behaviors and different explanatory messages, and they would mark it as either being they can make sense of it or they don't make sense of it. And at least the result seems to show that we can use standard machine learning approaches to effectively learn these kind of models. Okay, so now we will come back to the question of how does explicability fit into all of this. So the strategy that we've seen till now is the agent just decides to do what it thinks is the best course of action, and then comes up with the explanations after the fact, right? So it should be clear to see that not all plans or policies are equally easy to or equally hard to explain, right? Some of them might be easier to explain than others. So the agent, during its decision making, should try to incorporate the hardness or easiness of explaining it into its decision making process. And this is what I refer to as balancing communication and plan cost. So if you guys were paying attention to the video playing, what you would have seen is the robot showed like an optimal behavior, which included a bunch of explanations. And then it takes this longer route, because as far as the robot is concerned, that's the optimal path to take. And then there is this shorter path, which requires less explanation, but is costlier for the robot. So if the communication was particularly expensive operation to do, the rational thing as far as the robot to follow should be this path which requires less explanations, but is costlier in execution, right? So what that means is we now need systems and agents that are capable of kind of trading off between these different metrics that include the cost of the plan that it's going to follow, the cost of the explanatory messages it's going to provide, and also the penalty that it will incur if it provides an incomplete explanation, right? So if it doesn't give all the explanation, it's the human is going to think the plan is suboptimal or invalid, and there is going to be some cost associated to it. So the most general version of it is obviously like a multi-objective planning problem. We won't look at that specific version. Instead, we'll just consider a case where it's a linear combination of these costs. So how do we kind of come up with plans like this, right? So in particular, we looked at this framework called expectation-aware planning, where now the agent needs to reason with both its model of the world and what the human believes the model of the world. And when it comes up with the plan, comes up with a solution, the solution now includes both the explanatory messages and the plan. So at first sight, this might seem like it's much more harder than normal planning problem, but in fact, it can be shown that we can turn this multi-agent planning, at least multi-model planning problem into a single agent planning problem by leveraging existing compilations from epistemic planning literature, where basically we create this new augmented planning problem where the agent's action, the agent state consists of what the actual agent state is, what the human believes the agent state is, and also include these meta-fluence that corresponds to the human's belief about the agent model. And what that final part lets us do is now it lets us model explanations as just another set of actions. But those set of actions has effects on these kind of additional fluence. And these additional fluence is going to control how the effects of the robot action, how the robot's action affects the human's belief about the state. So there are these new conditional effects and conditional preconditions that are controlled through these meta-fluence. Okay. Also, it's if it's just plan validity, this turns into just a classical planning problem. But if you also need to ensure optimality, you have to do additional checks at the goal time to make sure the plan is optimal in the updated human mental model. So why go through all this trouble, right? One, it allows us to model now new concerns that were previously ignored. This includes things like capturing epistemic side effects of robots-centric action. By this, what I mean is there are a lot of information that are conveyed just by the act of doing something. So if the robot wants to show that a door is unlocked, right? It doesn't have to always say that aloud. It can go and just open the door, right? So that action has an epistemic side effect in that you now know that the door is unlocked. And there is also ontic side effects of robots' communicative action in the sense that the act of the robot communicating could have implications on the robot state. So if there is like some battery being used by saying things aloud, that will affect what the robot can later do. So now we can capture those kind of things in this model. And also we can leverage a lot of like planning heuristic, because now it's just a classical planning problem. We can leverage planning heuristics here to choose explanation. And in fact, for the evaluation, what we looked at was how does these kind of compilation compare to existing model space search method. And what we found out was, at least when the explanation length is long, these kind of compilation does help in reducing the time taken to solve the problems and stuff like that. Okay, so that brings us to the end of the first part of the talk. So in the second part, I would like to talk about the next dimension of estimation, which is basically addressing asymmetry in inferential capabilities. So in this case, let's look at the simplest case. We go back to our human-aware planning setting. Is a robot is a human, and now we even imagine the human has the same model as a robot. If for some reason the human is not the capability of the human to reason with that model is not the same, even though they have the same model, what the human might expect could be quite different from what the robot decides to do. So even when the models are the same, there is a scope for explanations here. So rather than like doing an explicit modeling of humans reasoning computational system, what I'll rather do here is talk about some of the strategies that I have used in my work to kind of address this kind of inferential differences. And the first thing we'll talk about is allowing for more interaction between the agent and the human, in particularly allowing for foils or alternate plans. So I don't know if you guys remember, but when I started, I said there are two kinds of questions I look at. One is why this plan, or why this plan as opposed to something else. So the something else here refers to what the human is usually referred to as the foil or alternate plans. And this kind of reflects what the human was expecting from the agent. So having these kind of foils as part of the question can be helpful to us in two ways, right? Like in multiple ways, actually. One, we don't have to rely on some kind of model to kind of predict what they were expecting and explain with respect to that. And the second thing is, by knowing what they were expecting, we can provide more concise explanation. And also you can provide additional information that could help them walk through the reasoning. So if they were like providing some plans, like a few plans that they were expecting, and those plans are not feasible in the robot's model, you could actually point out the step at which the plan might fail. And that could be helpful for them to make sense of the information. So one of the challenges with allowing for foils is, in most cases, people probably won't be able to give you the full plan. They would rather might just specify some part of the plan or policy or something like that. So in our earlier robot case, they might just say, okay, why didn't you pick up the purple block, instead of giving you a full plan, right? So I've looked at various ways of expressing these kind of foils. But regardless of the way the files are represented, in general, what they capture is they provide some constraints to what the human thinks is possible. And what that means is, even with the files, the system would have to explain like some property of a constraint planning problem. So we haven't completely gotten out of the woods yet. So in the case of, let's say, in the case of the block stacking thing, they ask, why couldn't you pick up the purple block? It's because the purple block may be something that the robot wasn't capable of doing, right? So it just means that the constraint planning problem is unsolvable. So now you need to explain why the problem is unsolvable. In the case of a suboptimal foil, you have to explain why every solution possible, given this constraint, is going to be costlier than what the current plan is. Okay, so what else can we do? One thing we can do is, instead of talking about the entire model in all of its details, we can kind of abstract and simplify the task and only expose enough details that is relevant to the user's question. So in my work, I mostly focus on state abstraction that look at aggregating different states, and in particularly methods that use syntactic operations to come up with these kind of abstract models. I can get to those details, but they're not as important. But just to kind of ground out the kind of intuition behind this, just think about a simple rover domain, right? Here a rover could be making use of a lot of information, and its state could be quite complex. It needs to think about the location of the sun, it needs to think about the location of the samples that are there, it needs to think about obstacles. There are a lot of information it needs to process at any given point of time. But if the user is asking, given this map, why the rover couldn't go to the green cell, most of this information is irrelevant, right? All you need to talk about is the fact that there are obstacles, and given these obstacles, you can't really get to the goal. This is the green cell. So this is the basic intuition I use, like using state abstractions to kind of simplify things. So here again, the explanation explanation identification takes the form of a search, but now the search is over a lattice of possible abstraction, where you have the most abstract model at the top, and more concrete models as you go down. And you're trying to find out a model that is concrete enough to support the question, like concrete enough to establish the property that's trying to be explained. Also, I don't want to give us a sense that these different dimensions are mutually exclusive. So even in this case, since you're giving model information, this can still be thought of as a form of model reconciliation, but under some specific assumptions. And it's even possible to think of this as a way to kind of assume prototypical models when you don't have any information about the robot, the human model at all. So these kind of things are still helpful, even if the human model isn't actually an abstract model and things like that. And there are also additional advantages of using these kind of lattices. One is you can actually tailor the lattice to give different kinds of explanation at different levels. For example, if you have a task and motion planning setting, right, you can have all the task information in much higher levels of the lattice than the motion level information. So when a person asks for an explanation, they will probably get the task level information before getting any like motion level constraints and stuff like that. Here's a video that shows that, and it also shows that we can also tailor the explanation based on the specific question. So if the person's question actually includes information like some kind of motion level parameters that needs to be used, you can actually skip all these task level models and go to a more detailed model to give them more specific explanation. But yeah, so that's that. So again, evaluation here includes both an empirical evaluation and a user study. And this is a more recent user study where we basically looked at how abstractions could help in reducing cognitive load on the human's end. And we measured cognitive load here in terms of NASA TLX scores. And this basically, we had the person play a game, and they were not told, they didn't have the full information about the game. And we had two groups of people, one group of people who got explanation that use abstractions and one who did not. And we did find, as one would expect, that the group that did use abstraction explanation reported lower levels of cognitive workload as compared to the other. Okay, so abstractions form one form of simplification. Obviously, there are other forms of simplification possible. So I'll just quickly talk about this one, which is basically kind of decomposing the problems into smaller sub-problems. So in this specific case, like going back to our rover example, even in the abstract version, we don't have to really talk about getting all the way to the final goal, right? So there is this basically that bottleneck cell that is highlighted in red. You can always say that getting to that cell is a prerequisite for getting to the final goal, and I can't even get to that cell. So you are reducing the horizon they need to reason about for the planning problem. So it becomes easier on their end. In particular, I made use of state landmarks from it's a concept from planning literature, which basically talks about landmarks as being facts or formulas that every feasible plan for the problem should satisfy. As in, like, if there is it's a ordered set of, if it's a partially ordered set of formulas, all plans should all valid plans should satisfy them in that given order. So the only the interesting twist here is the fact that when you have things like unsolvable problems, there are obviously no landmarks because there are no solutions. So one thing we did here is actually relax the problem even further, so we can generate these kind of landmarks and then give information regarding that landmarks, the sub goals, in the more detailed model. So that's just a detail there. I also applied both the abstraction and the sub goal generation and things like that within the domain of debugging dialogue model. So this was a tool IBM developed for people to write planning models for dialogue generation. So I applied the explanation methods we developed as a debugging tool there. And this was both presented at ICAPS as a paper and as a demo. And it also won, it was one of the winners of Best Demo Award. Okay, and also I won't go into too much details here, but sub-goals can also be used as a way to summarize policy. So given a policy, you can kind of break it up into these kind of landmarks or sub-goals and talk about like different parts of the policy as achieving different kinds of sub-goals. So that helps kind of summarize people, and people can interactively like expand different parts of the policy. Okay, this finally brings us to the ongoing work and proposed work. As I said, one of the bigger parts that is remaining is to look at addressing vocabulary mismatch. So most of the work we talked about assumes that the robot's model is already expressed in terms that a human can understand, right? So all it needs to do is find the right information, and it can just give that information to the user, right? But this may not always hold true, especially if the system is like some RL system that's using some black box simulator, or is it even a model-based RL system that is learned and inscrutable model? It'll be very hard to kind of describe, like give explanation in the terms of those kind of models. So what we actually need is we need a way to convert these model information into terms that users can understand. Particularly, I plan to look at settings where I plan to look at scenarios where the user is ready to provide a set of binary concepts which can act as state fluents for the system. So the agent is going to, actually the users are going to provide these concepts in the form of a set of positive and negative example for each concept. So here you have a picture of Montezuma's Revenge. A concept could be the person is next to the skull. So the person, the user could say, here are some positive examples where the person is next to the skull, some negative examples where they're not. You can learn a binary classifier, and then the system can actually use that classifier to detect when that concept may be present or absent, and then use these kind of conceptual traces to build a symbolic approximation of the model. So these symbolic approximations don't have to be complete. They don't have to capture all of the models, but just the parts of the model that is relevant to the current question. It might also be the case that the concepts they provide are not complete enough even to answer the question they asked, because maybe there is a concept they didn't think was relevant here and they just didn't bring it. So the systems we develop also have to be able to handle those kind of incompleteness and be able to detect when such things are incomplete. The next thing is also the fact that we are creating post hoc models means the system, at least to some degree, need to be capable of at least quantifying its uncertainty about these learned models, so that it doesn't just give out explanations that aren't true and that causes the human to place trust, that undeserved trust on the system. So like this could happen because the system came up with the explanation without sampling enough, or because the classifier it learned to generate these explanations are incomplete, and so on. Okay, and the final another work I would like to look at is to extending the inferential explanations to stochastic settings. So one of the interesting things is with stochastic setting, it's not just we're not just adding more details, but people are notoriously bad about reasoning with probabilities. And so I would like to take the methods I've studied for like deterministic planning problem, kind of place them in this context of extremely general planning formalism of max prob SSPs, and try to revisit all the explanatory queries here. So just to remind everyone, max prob SSPs are a generalization of like stochastic shortest path problems, in that it's not guaranteed that there exists a proper policy. As in, like, there is no guarantee that there is a policy that will take the agent from the initial state to goal with probability 1. So you could, even if we mask all the probabilities to the user, there are still things like you can ask interesting questions like, rather than just asking, why can't this policy take me to the goal? You can ask questions like, why doesn't this policy take me to the goal all the time? So there are interesting variations possible there. And also I would like to take this opportunity to revisit some of the queries related to the cost that I haven't looked as much in as the ones about validity and unsolvability. Like, why is this policy costlier and things like that? Or why is the cost of this policy above certain threshold and things like that. So the part of the plan here would involve revisiting the concepts from the previous work, like state abstraction, problem decomposition, things like local approximation, and kind of see how this how these things could fit into the setting. And the other point, at least I do believe in, is in the end, deterministic planning problems are more understandable to people. So it's also it remains an open question how much leverage we can do by simplifying these problems into just deterministic problem. There are a lot of determinization methods, like what kind of queries we can answer either by just purely deterministic versions, or just considering qualitative non-determinism. So we don't talk about probabilities and things like that. And also I would like to look at like additional information that you could give to help people better understand, right? So you could give things like, here is a optimistic trace from initial state to goal that already takes this much cost. So these are information that could be helpful in helping people understand. Okay, so here are some service achievements and miscellaneous information. This is the thesis timeline I had in mind. So with at least defense in March. And again, coming back to thesis contribution. So things that I have completed, I have marked in green, and the things that are remaining are marked in blue. Thank you so much.
Okay. So I'm not sure how you actually managed to get through all that, but now you can take a breath and maybe people. So right now we are open for public questions. So the questions from committee members can ask anytime, and people, other non-committee members also can ask questions. So if you want to ask question, unmute yourself and ask.
Hi, Sarath, I had a question.
Yeah, sure.
First of all, it was a great talk. So my question was based on slide 29 and 30.
Yeah, let me just jump through
Sure.
to a slide. Okay.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
since you mentioned that the search over the belief space can only consider the most constrained and the most relaxed model. So the question was, like, when we are providing explanations back to the user, is there a does the model still have, does the agent still have access to the specific user models in order to provide user specific explanations also in that case, or will the explanations
No, please finish completely.
No, yeah. So will the explanations be generalized only based on the spectrum of the most constrained and from the most constrained to the most relaxed model?
So the specific instance here, what the kind of explanation we are trying to generate was what was called the conformant explanation. Basically, what I was trying to say here is I'm coming up with a set of explanatory messages that would cover all of the models in the space. So the technical details that did not get covered here is the fact that if I come up with an explanation that covers the most constrained and most relaxed, it is guaranteed to cover everything in the middle. So it's a valid explanation for the entire set. But the trade-off there is it could be a lot more, a much more, like a much larger explanation than it is required. But that is the trade-off happening because you don't know the exact model and you are trying to come up with an explanation that covers all, right? And the all includes the most relaxed and most constrained. So you have to anyway come up with an explanation if that's the mode of explanation you use. But I've also looked at other variations where it's more about like question answering kind of a thing, where the system would actually, would actually ask questions about what the human might know or might not know. So it's reducing the uncertainty there. So it can come up with more concise explanations. Does that answer the question?
Yes, yes. I was talking about that trade-off only. Thanks.
Yeah, cool. Yeah.
Other questions?
So there's another alternative there, which is if you had a probability distribution over the possible human models, that you might do probabilistic conformant.
Exactly. I think this was one of Dr. Beamkim's question. Like, so the way I was thinking about is not just probabilities, but also thinking about some kind of decision theoretic version where you could have a penalty for missing an explanation. So you can trade off between the cost of explanation and the expected penalty you might like incur from not giving all the explanation. So if the explanations are too costly and the cost of not giving a correct explanation for one of those models with very, very low probability is not that high, then we can do these kind of trade-offs. So yeah, that in fact, that was one of the questions, yeah, Dr. Beamkim had. Yeah, so I completely agree. So that's just to summarize, yeah, I completely agree.
Hi, Sarath. I have one question. So this is for the case where you have binary concept classifiers.
Oh, okay. So this is the vocabulary mismatch. Okay, let me just go there. Yeah. Okay. Yes.
Yeah, so basically you're getting examples from the user about positive and negative examples and you're training a classifier, right?
Yeah.
What
yes.
if that classifier is noisy? Now it does not learn the perfect information, right? You can end up learning incorrect information.
Yeah, exactly. So that is a problem. So what I'm currently looking at to address that is looking at a way where, so you can have an observation model. So the fact that you have learned a noisy classifier, you can kind of look at, say, held out examples to kind of see what is the probability of this classifier giving the right explanation, and use that as an as a observation model. So basically the current search that I'm kind of thinking about for this problem takes the form of, you're going to look at different states, right? And test the action in those states. And look at what concepts are present or absent in that state, and use that to update my belief about some model component. So the simplest example is usually preconditions. So if there is a state where a concept is absent, but the action is executable, that concept can't be a precondition. That's the usual assumption we can do when our classifiers are perfect. Right? When the classifiers are not perfect, are possibly noisy, we can actually use that in observation model just to predict the posterior that concept is a precondition. Does that make sense? Kind of.
Yeah, sure. Thanks.
Yeah.
So, Bean, did you want to ask a question now, or
I think you might be on
you're
mute.
muted? I think.
I always do that. And I can't see myself. So if you're looking at messy background of mine, apologize. I'm curious if the explanation that the agent would give is sort of causally consistent. And by which I mean, if you have a bottleneck like that rock in the middle and you can't go through, and a human asks, why isn't this plan valid? And robot says, oh, because of that thing. Now, imagine another scenario where there was 2 rocks after that rock. So even if that rock was removed, he couldn't go through anyway. So then the explanation should be, you have to remove the whole this rock. And now extrapolating farther, let's say maze was a little more complicated. Now there are other obstacles depending on once the rock is removed, let's say you removed all those 3 rocks. There are more things, and depending on what you do after passing those rocks, what might be in the way of the agent reaching to the goal might be different. So what would happen in that case, and is your method causally consistent in that way?
So I'll just talk through the echo. So the thing was my current work hasn't looked at this idea of like actionability, right? Like if you're giving some explanation to the user, they need to be able to act upon it and fix other things. I haven't looked at throughout the work. So in this particular case, the fact that there is a rock, if you remove the rock, there might be other reasons for explaining the thing. But the scenario where I did look at that was this one, where it was the debugging case, right? So it is, in this case, it was kind of, in the terms you were using, causally consistent in the sense that when I present an abstract model, right, only if you fix things in that model would it work. So if you can't fix that, but I suppose there is still the question of you fix that and something else pops up. So that's always going to be currently an issue with the thing, but at least the point is, regardless of anything else, you have to fix something there. Like, so in that case of the rock, it would be like, at least that rock has to be removed before you can do anything. So it's a step-by-step thing. So, but in general, I haven't quite looked at the question of actionability of explanation, because partly the settings are slightly different in my cases, because in this case, at least in some of the prototypical examples, I've looked at the robot knows the right model. The human just is like an end user who's trying to make sense of it. It's not like the human is trying to change the actual result. It's not quite a debugging scenario, but like in debugging scenarios, I completely agree that these are important factors. And I like the place where I slightly looked at was this in the application scenario.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Oh, I can't see anybody. I'm sorry. Maybe a simple way to ensure the claim, you could say, okay, here is the first possible cause, yet disclaimer, this is not just because you fixed this. That seems in the downline, like let's say you're using this method at a company and companies using this to maybe move a robot in a mat. That would become very important down the road in the downstream task. Thanks for the answer.
So I just basically to follow up on what been brought up, I was wondering, Sarath, don't you see the connection to, do you see the connection to MCE, MME, which is also the extent to which, because to some extent, much of this stuff to me is causal anyway. The kind of example she was telling me is you gave a partial explanation and that wasn't enough, and so I was thinking whether there is a connection to MME, MCE.
So the place where MME would differ is in the sense
you might want
that,
to explain what it is again, MME, MCE.
Oh, yeah, okay. So I'll just go back to the MME thing. So yeah, the one explanation I skipped. Yeah, so the basic concept here was MMEs where after you give a set of, like the thing is, here let me try to ground it with an example. So here the point is, the system gave an explanation. Let's say in the case of the robot not picking up light blocks, right? It gave an explanation that I can't pick up light blocks. Then later on, the person found out in some ways through future interaction or other explanation that the robot can actually turn heavier blocks into lighter blocks. Just to forgive me for this unrealistic example, but it can turn heavier blocks to lighter blocks. Now the person is confused why that explanation was incomplete, why that explanation makes sense anymore, because the robot could have now picked up the heavier block by first turning it into lighter block and then picking up the block now and placing it. And then a monotonic explanation here would be give enough information that no future information would actually violate this requirement. As in, like, no future information about the robot will make the human change their, would cause any of the previous explanations to become invalid. I think the difference here between MME and the example that Dr. Bean-Kim was pointing out is the exact case that here the new information is not coming from the robot, but from the human set. So when even here, the MME would have stayed the same, that it just found out the rock. But the human went and dug up the rock and removed it. So the actual MR has shifted. So MR has gone from being MR to MR prime. So now new explanations are possible there, right? What was previously impossible has now become possible. And there is a new kind of a thing that needs to be taken into account. So that was why I was looking at the D3WA, that was the debugging interface, because that was exactly the case where first the problem was unsolvable. You gave them the core of unsolvability. They will make changes there to make that solvable, but that might trigger something else and they'll have to do it. I completely agree that it would be interesting to look at like a symmetric concept of monotonicity even there, where we give all the information that regardless of other changes in other parts of the model, if you fix these things, it will stay the same. But I would imagine that those kind of explanations could become extremely large. But like Dr. Bean-Kim was saying, we could always say, okay, this is just the first issue you have to solve. You have to solve this issue before moving on to other issues. And so I think that also makes sense.
Okay. Other public questions? Anybody else has a burning public question? Please go ahead.
I have a basic question, Sarath.
Yes.
Is there a difference between human-aware planning and expectation-aware planning? Because you use that terminology when you started.
Yeah. So expectation-aware planning was a specific term I used to describe the problem of coming up with. I'll just go back to the formulation. So you could kind of think of expectation-aware planning as being just like a subset of a human-aware planning. Human-aware planning is like a larger umbrella where there are a lot of challenges. Expectation-aware planning was looking at a very specific case where you have two models, the robot and the humans model, and you're trying to come up with a plan and explanation such a way that you are doing the trade-off between the three metrics. So it was a very specific instance of the larger human-aware planning problem. So the human-aware planning problem could have other aspects, like which are not even related to explanations like interpretability and things like that. So this is like a thin slice of this larger.
Right, got it. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay. Any other questions for public in the public session? Again, as I said, the committee members can bring up questions now or in the closed, depending on their judgment as to what might be a good time to bring them up.
I will go ahead and ask another one.
Go ahead.
So my question is about the case where the human has limited inferential capability. Now, in normal cases where the human and the robot had different models of the problem, you have an explicit representation of what those differences might be in terms of, say, possible preconditions and possible effects, right? It looks to me like you never have an explicit model of what the limitations might be in terms of the human's inferential capabilities, like depth of inference or inability to deal with disjunction or, things of that nature.
Yeah.
Am I correct in that?
Yes, and part of that was a bit of an intentional thing, because right now the cognitive models that kind of try to capture like bounded rational agents, as far as I'm aware, are still starting out. So having explicit models that we could reason with is I don't know how widely applicable they are, but instead what I generally do is I fold in the their limitations in inference back into the model. So by like doing something like an abstraction, right? You are assuming a more optimistic model, like people are going to make mistakes. So it doesn't always have to work one by one, but you are looking at a more relaxed problem where people are only able to look at certain things, and they are able to make, like, they might think there are plans that are possible, which are actually not possible. So you're right, I haven't looked at explicit models. So probably the closest I've come to looking at explicit models is probably in works I've done in explicability, where I've looked at models like noisy rational models. So where it's like a Gibbs distribution. So even rather than selecting the optimal plan, they might have some probability of selecting some like a lower quality plan, or like more costlier plan, or something like that. So yeah, within explanation, I tend to like rather look at strategies where like more general strategies which could reduce the inferential burden on the human's end, and also look at kind of like, looking at more relaxed models so that it can kind of possibly account for mistakes they might make. So that's.
It seems to me that there's probably an opportunity here.
Yeah.
Right. So if you, in fact, had some mechanism of recognizing complexity in the planning model, right, and then recognizing that, well, this guy has limited inferential capability, and so this part of the model is really complex, and so his confusion may be related to that. Right.
Yeah.
That you could potentially take advantage of that kind of thing.
Right. So the place where I'm currently thinking along those lines, where in the case of stochasticity, so something like right, so something like a question about like probability of getting to the goal is 0, right? So there we don't really need to talk about actual probabilities there. You just think about the determinized version of the problem, which is a simpler representation. And you can say, okay, if I think I can optimistically do anything, even then I can't come up with a plan that will take me to the goal. And you can now explain with respect to this simplified representation, and then kind of talk about that in those contexts. And also in the answer, like you had asked a similar question on like, how do you come up with explanations for more complex, complex domains than classical planning problems, and which you had mentioned in the comprehensive question. So one of the things I had kind of talked about there is looking at this kind of relaxation called problem class relaxation, where you can actually relax the problem class from, let's say, even if it's like a numeric planning problem, maybe the question they ask doesn't really require talking about the numbers, right? You can just still remove those numbers. Or you can talk about maybe the problem, even if it was a PDDL 2.1 planning problem, maybe even if you think about atomic actions, even then the problem is unsolvable. Then you can talk in those terms. In fact, I would say, this is again just an argument from my end, one could see works like from Jörg Hoffman and Rebecca Eifler, where they turn an oversubscription planning problem into saying these different objectives cannot be achieved together. It's in a sense doing a similar simplification, where they're taking a planning problem and kind of turning into like a CSP kind of a problem, where they're saying these things are actually, there is a conflict between these two objectives and I cannot achieve them together. But then there is a question of people might ask more and more questions, and you will have to dig more and more and reveal more and more information to give them the full information, full explanation. Sorry if I just kind of, yeah.
Right. It may not be that you can, for example, relax out all the numeric considerations.
Of course.
It may be that only certain resources are important to this particular problem, and therefore you can, sort of get rid of the rest of the numeric stuff and only keep the critical resources in terms of the explanation.
So more than the problem, so even if the problem requires it, the question that they asked might not require it. So again, that question might be like a constrained form of this problem, right? Maybe the reason that question doesn't hold may not be because of these constraints. So even if the problem makes use of it, just answering that question, you could make even more relaxation. So that's yeah.
And the same thing is true for temporal, right? So it may be that the duration of certain actions doesn't matter at all, right? Or those time constraints doesn't matter, but there are other things that are interdependent in a way that the temporal constraints really matter.
I completely agree. Yeah.
So Sarath, continuing along those lines, in some of your work, you had some sort of weights for concepts in your abstracted lattice. Could you use that to reflect concepts that might be harder for people to understand, or to model this sort of inferential asymmetry?
I completely agree that that's completely possible. So the way, at least like the demo we showed, I think I was working with you on it. The way we kind of handled it there was it was hand coded. Like there was an hierarchy that we decided that task level constraints are are easier to understand than like motion level constraints. One could rely on those kind of things. And also the interesting question is like, is it possible to like automatically compute the complexity of these kind of concepts? One thing would be like looking at like maybe binary propositions are easier to understand than, let's say, like there are actual numeric constraints and things like that. There might be a hierarchy there. And also we can think about in the motion level, the particular domain we had, they were actual concepts which are redundant, but they were just capturing more and more, less and less less and less detail. So we had the grasping thing. There was a grasping at a specific grasp angle, then there was grasping a region, then reachability. So there also we could use those kind of hierarchy. Yeah, I completely agree with the use of this.
Okay, thanks.
Dave, I remember I thought of a title for a paper based on your question. We had this old paper on when is temporal planning really temporal. So we can write when does temporal planning really require temporal explanations? Because half the times when the temporal planning is basically deterministic, non-temporal, doesn't require actually temporal explanations. You can, sort of push people to be impressed, but I think that was not the part there. But it's a connection between problem relaxations and inferential complexity is certainly an interesting one. Are there any other open questions? Just one last chance to anybody not on the committee who wanted to ask a question before we close the public session and go into closed session in the interest of time. Going once, going twice. Okay. In that case, people who are not on the committee, please excuse yourself. And we are now going to be in the closed session. Okay, and also I will stop recording the session because